The Nikon Z6 Mark I and II and the Z7 Mark I and II. Our housing can accommodate any of those 4 cameras between the 2 different camera mounts that are included with it. Today I'm going to be shooting the Z6 Mark II with one of my very favorite lenses, the Nikon 8 to 15mm fisheye lens using the FTZ adapter. So without further ado, let's get it put together. First things first, let's go ahead and open up the housing. I'm going to set it down here on my assembly mat, and I'm going to unlock each of the locking lid snaps by lifting up on the lever and then lifting that lid snap. I'm going to do that to all 3 of them. And then I can lift that over the hook of the back and the same thing on the top here. That can let me remove the back. I will set it aside. And you'll notice that when we initially open the housing, you have 2 different camera mounts like I mentioned before. You're going to have one for the Z6 Mark II and the Z7 Mark II, and you'll have another camera mount for the Z6 Mark I and the Z7 Mark I. Since I'm going to be using the Z6 Mark II, I'm going to use this mount, and I'll keep this with my parts. And if we take a closer look on the inside, I have controls that interface with the camera. You'll notice that the camera mount slid out of the base, and I have included with the housing a manual hot shoe. And a manual hot shoe means that you have a ground and trigger only. Later on when I'm shooting strobes, I'll be shooting a TTL converter. So I'll simply swap this out for a TTL hot shoe. But for the rest of this video, let's go ahead and use this because the assembly procedure will remain the same between those 2. So I'm going to remove that out of the way, and then I'm going to go ahead and pre-align my controls. This is my lens release control, so I'll point it up like so, and then my back button focus, I will move up and out of the way. You're also going to notice on this housing that I have pre-installed extensions for both the back button and the shutter, as well as a handle extension so that I can have 2 handles for 2 different strobes that I'll be mounting. And in my shooting style, I like to have the extensions so that I can reach both of those controls very easily with that installed. So we'll have a link to the description below on how to install those extensions, but it is an accessory that I recommend using because it does allow you to have a more comfortable experience in the water. Turning our attention to the camera mount itself, you'll notice that there's a standard 1/4-20 threaded screw. That's of course going to correspond to the 1/4-20 threaded mount of your camera. So align that. You'll notice that there is an anti-rotation wall on this mount, and that is going to butt up to the back of the camera here. If we move the LCD screen out of the way, you'll notice that it butts up against the camera, preventing it from moving. Take a flat-headed screwdriver and tighten that down until it's snug. You don't need to over tighten it, but you do want to make sure it's snug. Any movement between these 2 pieces will translate to a misalignment with controls. So what we do, got the camera mount on there. And of course we preset the camera the way we want it to be in the housing, customize the function settings. But as far as installing the camera, all we have to do is take the included hot shoe, align it in the hot shoe mount of the camera, and make sure it is fully pressed forward so that the contacts are making contact with the camera. And we're going to slide the camera mount into the camera base like so. Make sure that our controls realign. And take a moment here. We're going to inspect this sealing surface and make sure that it's clean and free of debris. The back seals to the front using a compression seal. This means that we don't need lubricant on this particular O-ring. So we just need to make sure it's clean. And that being said, turn our attention to the back itself. You'll notice that this O-ring follows an outside perimeter at all times. It never takes an inside curve. That makes it a very stable O-ring. It doesn't follow a channel. Again, it's a compression O-ring, no lubricant required. As a matter of fact, I don't use lubricant here. Not that it would hurt it, but because I put lubricant, it has a tendency to attract things like debris, which could actually compromise my seal. So I don't use lubricant on this particular O-ring. I do check to make sure that the sealing surface underneath it is clean, as well as the O-ring itself. We've already checked this sealing surface. So now all we have to do is realign the back to the front, gently set it into place. I do like to take an opportunity to make sure that my video still switch is aligned. And then I can lift the lid snap over each hook of the 3 hooks, and then simultaneously I'm going to press down the left and the right, and I will go down and click it into place, and then I'll follow with the top. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to make sure that the lock's engaged, and I can't accidentally open these 3 locking snaps, and now that's the camera installed into the front. As mentioned before, I'm going to be shooting the Nikon 8 to 15mm lens. Now this lens won't inherently attach and bayonet to the camera body directly. You will need the FTZ adapter. Here I have the one without the bulbous mount on the bottom, but you can use either. If you use the one with the mount on the bottom, it will have to be pre-installed on the camera. In this case, I have this one, so I can simply remove the cap off the back of the lens, and then I can attach the lens itself to the adapter. Make sure I'm set to autofocus on my lens, and then I can get the included clamp, and you'll notice that I have 2 of the thinnest foam strips that can come with it. I'm going to remove the adhesive backing from that strip. I'm going to apply it to the inside diameter of that clamp. Like so. We'll do the same thing to the other side. Now you're only going to do this once, so take your time. Make sure it's aligned properly. Make sure the adhesion sticks. Okay, now that I have the pads installed on the clamp, I'm going to install the clamp onto the lens. Now you'll notice that the clamp has tabs. I'm going to make sure that these tabs are actually pointing towards what will be the camera body. So align those. And then what I like to do is kind of preset the lens to somewhere in the middle of its focal range. Here it's 12mm. I'm going to line one of those tabs up with the white dot on the lens itself. And you could have done this before you put the adapter on, either way. And then basically kind of just walk the clamp up your lens until you get to the ring that is going to allow for zoom. Make sure you keep walking it past the focus ring and up to the zoom ring. All right, perfect. Now, set that aside for now. Turn your attention to the housing itself. We're going to remove the cap. There's a retaining ring in here. You can use the included tool or your fingers at this point. Take this to set it to the side, and that cap can simply fall out of place. Set that with your spare parts. Check to make sure that your lens release control is going to engage your camera, and you can remove the body cap at this point. Set it with your spare parts. We're going to take the gear sleeve and we're going to drop it into place. And then we're going to take the gear sleeve retainer and drop it around that gear sleeve. Now we can use the included tool, which lets us reach the 2 notches on that retainer, and then simply thread it into place. No need to over tighten, it's just there to keep that gear sleeve from falling out of place. Now what I'm going to do is rotate the zoom control, and you'll notice that it's going to rotate the gear sleeve itself, and I'm purposefully going to align one of the 2 inner diameter ribs with the white dot on the camera body. You'll notice that because we have aligned the tab on the lens clamp itself with that white dot, it allows us to slide that tab and engage with the rib of the gear sleeve so that we can then bayonet it on into place. So we're going to go ahead and do that. As we feed the lens down into the gear sleeve, we're going to make sure that the tabs engage with the ribs of the gear sleeve itself. And once we've bayoneted the lens onto the camera body, we can use the zoom control to make sure that we are actually zooming the lens, which of course we are. And that works out perfectly. Now all we have to do is put a port on the system, and we'll create a vacuum and we'll go from there. Now for today's port system assembly video, I'm going to use the full 8-inch dome. I will typically go and travel with both the large dome and the compact dome for 2 different purposes, but we'll save that for another video. Let's go ahead and walk through how we put the large dome port onto this system. For this particular lens, I'm going to need the 20mm extension, and I'm going to need the large 8-inch dome port. So I find it easier to attach the extension to the dome port first. You can do it either way, but I find it makes this a little simpler to do. And in order to do that, I'm going to unthread all 3 of the thumb screws of the dome port itself until they do not protrude into the inside diameter. And I'm going to inspect the O-ring of the extension, make sure that it's clean and free of debris. And I'm going to do the same thing on the sealing surface of the dome. I'll run my finger across that sealing surface to clean off debris and feel for anything that might affect the seal. I'll do that again after I've applied some lubricant to the O-ring. Take a little bit of the included Ikelite lubricant. Doesn't take a lot. We're going to apply a small film of that to the O-ring of the extension. What we're doing here is the lubricant is not creating the seal, it's helping overcome the friction as the two pieces slide together. Again, apply a little bit to the sealing surface of the dome port. Now you'll notice that as if you look at the extension, you have 3 pockets that will correspond to the 3 thumb screws of this dome port. You'll also notice those 3 pockets on the port mount of the housing. Of course, all of these things line up and then the thumb screws go into those pockets. So if you notice, when you look at the dome port itself, one of those 3 thumb screws is going to correspond to what we call the top of your shade, and that's going to be the top of your housing. So in this case, it's this one here. I'm going to align those 3 thumb screws with these 3 pockets. And of course, the thumb screws will line themselves up as well. And I'm going to press that down into place, and then I'm going to tighten the 3 thumb screws of the dome port itself, not the extension this time. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the O-ring on the port mount of the housing. Just like the extension, we're going to use a little bit of lubricant. Again, doesn't take a lot, and you're going to run that around the O-ring of the port mount of the housing. Loosen the 3 thumb screws of the extension. Make sure that they don't protrude to the inside diameter of the extension itself. You don't want the O-ring to catch, you don't want the thumb screws to catch the O-ring. And again, we're going to check the sealing surface and apply a little bit of that lubricant to that sealing surface, making sure it's clean and free of debris. And just like we remember, we have the thumb screw that corresponds to the top of the shade. Of course, that's going to correspond to the top of our housing. And if we look closely, we have a pocket for that thumb screw at the top of the housing. If we roughly line that up, we can press the dome port down into place and then tighten the 3 thumb screws of the extension to the housing. Now you don't need to over tighten these thumb screws. They're there as a retaining method. They don't increase, they make a better seal. The seal occurred when the 2 pieces were put together with the O-ring. This just keeps it in place. And now we have a waterproof system here for the Nikon Z6 Mark II. But one last step that I'm going to do is I'm going to use the optional vacuum pump, and I'm going to create a vacuum inside this housing. I'll create a vacuum inside the housing, and I'll actually dive with it under a vacuum. This will do 2 things. It lets me make sure that I didn't screw up something in assembly, didn't forget an O-ring, I don't have a small leak. But when I'm in the water, it will provide a reinforcement to all the closing mechanisms. So if I find myself at the surface, where I'm actually the most susceptible to a leak in any system, I will have that vacuum pulling all of the parts together, especially useful in rough water and situations like that. So here's how you create a vacuum. Okay, you're gonna notice that the vacuum port here on the housing has a push button. When you push that push button, it actually releases the cap. And that cap is tethered, and it's tethered for a reason, because you don't wanna go diving without this cap installed. You'll notice that there's 2 piston seal O-rings. Again, I do apply a little bit of the Ikelite lubricant to that to make sure that this cap goes in and out of the valve nice and smoothly. Remove the cap by pushing the button, and then that'll allow us to install the vacuum pump barb. You'll push it down and hear it click into place. Set our housing down here, and now we can turn our attention to the pump itself, and we're going to use the hand pump to create the vacuum. you'll notice that the needle will move up. Now the number that you choose to go to is not what is critical. What is critical is that the needle will not move. If the needle's moving, that means that air is getting in, and if air can get in, that means water can get in. So what I'm gonna do is I generally go and I will pump it to 10. I have a large dome port here, so it's gonna be a larger volume of air. The more of air I have, the more I'll have to evacuate. So I'm gonna go ahead and pump this hand pump until that needle gets to 10. Once I've reached 10 on the gauge, what I wanna do is just watch the needle, make sure I don't have a steady drop. Again, a drop in the needle means that air is getting in, water will get in. So once I've checked that gauge and I make sure that it's holding and it's not dropping on its own, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to remove this vacuum valve, remove this pump from the housing, because what I wanna do is I wanna test this system. I don't wanna test this system with this attached. Let's say there was a potential leak in this. Well, I'm not diving with this, I'm diving with this. So what I do is I check it, I make sure I'm at 10, that's where I started, and I'm going to remove the barb, and I'm always going to make sure that if I remove something, I put something back in. In this case, I'm going to put the cap in. Now, ideally, you would do this, the night before. That's typically what I do. Make sure my camera's charged, make sure that I have, an SD card and I can take photos, and I will create a vacuum, and this will be sitting by the door so I can get it on my way out. If you don't have that kind of time luxury, give yourself 15-20 minutes, kind of let it sit, make sure that it holds a vacuum for that long, kind of a peace of mind. But after that time, whether it be 15 minutes or overnight, we're gonna come back in and we're going to push the button again to release the cap. We're gonna reinsert the barb. And then after we do that, you'll notice that once you reinsert the barb, because this is a one-way valve, that needle will jump back to where you went. Now there is a very small volume of air in the tube, which might minusculely affect where it jumps to, maybe 9.5, 9.75, but you're back to where you started. If you notice that either that needle is dropping or there's a huge discrepancy in, let's say we only went to 5, that means that there's a problem that we need to start investigating before we get in the water and find out why it didn't hold the vacuum. In this case, we're good. We went back to 10, that's where we started. So now I'm going to release the barb. I'm going to keep the vacuum on the housing. I'm going to dive with it under a vacuum, and then I'm going to go shooting and everything is going to be fine. I have a full view of my camera because of the clear back. I can see everything inside. I'm not relying on any sensors. I have a full visual on the safety of my camera and what's happening inside. I'm going to go diving, and then I'm going to come back, and I won't be able to open this system while it's under a vacuum. I won't be able to pull the port off. I won't be able to take the back off. I will have to release the vacuum in order to release the camera. And I can do it one of two ways. I can reinsert the barb into the valve, and I can use the release mechanism on the pump, and that will release and let the air back into the housing. Or if I don't have this with me, I can take this cap off and push a pencil or a pen down in and depress the release valve, and it will release the vacuum, and I can open up my system. Other than that, that's everything you need to know. You're ready to get in the water and go diving. There is one more thing I'll mention here in this video that I did not include in my list of accessories that I typically use, and that in this port, I will take this cap out and I will often put in a USB-C bulkhead. And that USB-C bulkhead lets me do two things. I can charge the camera and I can offload my images. A slight caveat to that with the vacuum is once you do take the cap off of the USB-C bulkhead, you will have to release the vacuum or re-vacuum the housing once you put the cap back on, but that is well worth it in order to keep my system fully assembled, and it lets me move forward throughout the week without disassembling the whole system. If you have any questions about the Z6 Mark 1, 2, or the Z7 Mark 1 and 2, or this system, or anything underwater photography related, shoot us a comment down below, or feel free to shoot us an email to ikelite@ikelite.com.